All right. Welcome to this week's episode of the Franchise Accelerator Podcast. What we're talking about this week is so important because last week we talked about the value of our business. And for some of us, maybe that was the first time we ever worked through that calculation, may have not loved the result, especially after looking at the last couple of years in hospitality. But that's okay because really the takeaway, the aha moment for whether you've started your own business, you've bought a business, the idea is that you are creating value every day. So it's not a fixed number. So whatever we came up with is not where we have to live. We can add value, we can make our business be worth more in the future, but it's something that we have to be thinking about every day. Right, Scott?
Absolutely.
What were some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, unless you're sitting on, you own your value, your land and all that, then you have to do something to increase the operational value.
Yeah.
And that's when we talk a lot about digging into the operations from a food cost, from a labor cost, from an expense standpoint, to show on your P&Ls that your company can have value. And that's where, again, saying it doesn't have to be the starting point where it is now. If we can do that and increase the profitability of your restaurant, that's going to get to that multiplier of where we find value.
Exactly. And I think for a lot of us, especially entrepreneurs, creative, we love developing something new. We love the idea of I'm investing now into the future, whatever it is. But, I don't think most of us aren't like Jeff Bezos who can run a unprofitable business and have a mega yacht in the south of France, right? Like we have to show a bottom line number and we have to really push ourselves to be profitable at any stage of the game. And that's what we're talking about today is really taking that hard look at how do I get to profitability and then how do I maintain that profitability, improve that profitability moving forward. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about here is steps to increase value. So the first one we mentioned a little bit already is focus on profitability. Now what we mean here is as much of as a mindset as anything else is really having that standard that this business will be profitable, especially for those of you who've bought a business. Maybe you bought into a franchise, or it's Franchise Accelerator. Maybe you bought an existing location. At some point, someone showed you what the profitability should be. And rather than, be discouraged if we're not there, I think a lot of this is having that focus on what do I need to do to get us to profitability.
Yeah, definitely. And some of those franchises, have a theoretical profit that they're looking for based upon what they feel like the numbers can be. And what we see a lot of times is from the operator that they're not getting to that number. They don't know how to get to that theoretical number. And that's where they're coming up short from what they thought that initial investment was going to bring them, right? Yes. They invested in that franchise for a certain reason, and now they're a couple years in or whatever time frame in, and they're wondering, why is that not what I thought it was going to be?
Yes. And I think whether you've, whether you're a franchise or you're an independent who has multi-unit, I think it starts with asking a good question, right? So if you did invest in a business and it's not showing the result that you want, I think asking the question of like, what am I doing differently? Maybe you have a larger management team than they had before. Maybe your sales aren't what they are before, but we really have to ask some of those good questions and get to at least the difference. Like, hey, if we were doing this, this is what it would be. So we can really start to plan to how we get to be better.
Yeah, that's why the budgeting becomes so important is knowing what the goal is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we talk to all that they want this number, but they have no plan in place to get to that number.
Yeah.
So when we start budgeting out what we can project sales, what we can predict in expenses, what we can predict or forecast in labor and food costs, it gives a better idea to say, if we do all this, this is going to be the number.
Right.
At least a starting point to where it might be. I mean, we're not even there yet by operating those levels,
right,
but we run into so many people that don't even have that in place. So
yeah. And I think the last piece, which will sort of lead us into our second part here, is the idea of if you don't know what each location is earning, say you have 5 units and you don't know because there's all these allocated expenses, the first step here to really focusing on profitability is remove all the allocated expenses, right? Because we've had calls where it's like, oh, well, that's just, my accounting team allocates that expense to this location. No. So to look at profitability, our recommendation is first, remove all those extra expenses and really focus just on what's on those 4 walls, like what each location can control and what each location ultimately earns. And then we can figure about those allocated expenses in other places. So profitability, we want to look at 4 walls. Are you generating what you need to out of each of your locations to make sure that everything as a whole works?
Definitely. because they're not going to be able to control the rent. They're not going to be able to control the corporate overhead. So if we're talking about operations and how to increase those areas of profit, like Ann said, we have to start with what we can control in the four walls and then come up with targets for those first.
Yes. So as anyone knows me, stop the journal entries, right? Stop just placing expenses on the P&L. Like, we're going to deal with those later. We want four walls. This is what this store brings in. This is what this store has to a bottom line. And then we can figure out everything else. What leads us into number 2, which is weekly accountability. So the whole idea of weekly accountability, we talked a little bit about this previously, is the idea that we should hold each location to some target every week. Now, you come from, larger corporate locations. I would bet they did weekly accountability.
Everything was weekly. I mean, you were judged by your labor weekly, by your cost of goods weekly, by your expenses weekly, your profit weekly. And I mean, when you dig into that, that allows you to manage it daily and shiftly. I think that's where, yes, we're looking at it weekly for our targets, but because we have those targets, it allows us to look at every shift, every day, and gives us 14 chances to have a great week, which then in turn gives us 4 or 5 chances to have a great month. And I think that's where, if you're only looking at it from a month standpoint, it doesn't allow you to make those improvements throughout the month, and sometimes the results aren't where we want it to be because of that.
I agree. And I think so much of this podcast, of this program, is transitioning us from, one location, a smaller company, to really thinking bigger, right? Thinking like a larger restaurant group, thinking like a franchise. But so many times in the franchise world, everyone goes to period. And I think whether you're on a month-end close or period-end close, operationally we have to be weekly, right? So whether it's, I don't care if it's period or month, it's still too long, right? So I hate the argument of well, I do it period. Well, that's still 4 weeks, right? So we still need to evaluate ourselves 4 times during that period. And part of that is, again, focusing on those 4 walls. You got to get that information to that management team so they can make a change.
Definitely. And I mean, like I said, yes, we will look at it period or monthly to look at how the month went, because that allows you to get rent and allows you to get the electricity and utilities and all those things in. But from weekly is what we're managing from an operations standpoint. When we talk about the 4 walls, we're managing labor, we're managing food costs, we're managing our controllable expenses. And if we're doing that each week, it allows us to have a better chance to get the month or period result that we're looking for, instead of basically rolling the dice and saying, let's look at it as a month and hope that it comes out to how we want it to be, instead of getting each week results in to say, hey, we have to do this we're 2 weeks in, we have to do this the last 2 weeks to get our month result.
Exactly. And I think, so many times here, as we've grown, especially if you're, a restaurant group that's been around 20 years or however long you've been here, 20 years ago, this was hard to do, right? Probably impossible, right? To have a weekly sales and weekly cost of goods, weekly labor, would have been really hard. But here's where we want to evolve, right? We want to use technology to benefit us. And even if we can't get our managers 100%, we want to embrace the imperfection and get them what we can. Because if a manager doesn't have, their cost of goods for last week, or their labor for last week, or they're just doing it in the back of the napkin, they're not going to have a good result.
Right. And like you said, as much as we'll say, hey, we want to be in our restaurants and we want to be focusing on there is a technology aspect that's going to give you all this information now. Most of the POSs will give you, real-time labor results. So you could have a manager tracking it from lunch and dinner, definitely the day after. Cost of goods might be a little more weekly if you do an inventory, but you can track what you spend on your food deliveries, your produce deliveries, your drink deliveries all week long, to know about what it should be based upon the sales volume that you're forecasting, you're budgeting for. So all that technology is going to kind of wrap back around to allow you to see these things without spending a lot of time on them.
Well, exactly. And that's where, as an accountant, I would say, let the accountants do their thing, right? Like, they have time, they got to book the payroll, they got to make sure it's perfect. Like, there's a whole thing over there. But be creative with your ops team, because they could probably get those same numbers. As imperfect as they are, again, they're not going to go on an annual report, not going to go on a tax return, but they could probably get some sort of feedback just from the software they're using on their own, and not having to wait for someone to have a stamp of approval. Yep, this is final. Like, that's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to give some feedback to our team so that way they can improve in next week's time versus next period's time.
Yeah, definitely. Especially things that we're talking about, like an hourly labor. Yeah, we know what the manager salaries are going to be. They're going to be pretty, standard. The owner salary is going to be what it is. But that hourly labor, you could impact every day, every shift. It can be a huge difference. And we're talking about percentage points on, a month that you could be doing 50, 100, or 200,000 in sales, whatever your sales volume is, really could multiply out to a big number.
Yes.
And can get away really quickly. So when we're talking about adding profit, ability to your restaurant, that is where you want to start, because you can literally impact it every minute of every day.
Yes. And the third one kind of ties into that, because I think sometimes when we're looking at the overall profitability, the overall valuation of one location versus another, we forget that there's intangibles in those numbers, right? As much as we love it to be black and white, we love it to live in Excel, there are intangible factors that can impact how a store performs. And the biggest one of those is the management team.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where having a great, blend of that, and, depending on how large your restaurant is, if you have multiple managers, maybe one of your managers is an external from some other restaurant company that brings something to the table, where another one's an internal manager that was maybe a server or a line cook, that they're coming through the ranks, they know your culture, they know all that. So kind of blend of manager, because like I said, that's going to directly impact that bottom line. And I think people sometimes overlook that, what a great general manager or what a great executive chef could bring to your operations financially.
Exactly. And if we think about, the whole point of this episode is to hopefully shed some light on the fact that we can add value every day. So if we add $1 to a bottom line of an underperforming store, we've actually added 2.5 times that to the value of our business overall. So if you think about how much, these little changes can impact the overall valuation, it really can motivate us to make some changes that we may not love, to look at things differently. And I think, the other aspect of management team is also looking at that corporate team, because if you really feel like you're doing all this work and the bottom line isn't showing it, it's not saying get rid of your corporate team, because we obviously want, you to have a good support system, but we really need to be creative, because wages have gone up, we're paying more for managers, and that could be 20-30% more than what we were paying 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, G&A or below the line from the restaurant company could be a huge impact. And I think that's where it's not that we're saying get rid of all your people that have been with you maybe for a long time.
We don't want to do that.
Or help you grow it. But I think you really need to establish, and what we always do with our clients is kind of the organizational chart of what's everyone's role.
Yeah.
And how does it, whether it's a sales role, whether it's a profit role, whether it's a finance role, what are they doing and how does that impact the entire company? And I think as you look at that, you'll see what the needs of your company will be. Depending on your sales, you might not need a CFO and a district manager and a VP.
And a controller.
Right, and a controller, all these things,
right,
where one person could maybe fill the role of multiple ones, or if you have a great director of operations, they then could be part of your buying team,
Yes.
and just merging some of that together could really help the operational team have what they need to operate the restaurant.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, we love to use sports analogies, but sometimes that end result of, okay, I need this to be $1 million valuation or $2 million valuation, whatever that is, then that means, working back from that 2.5 times, that's what it has to be. Because as much as we say there's other ways to evaluate your company, especially in hospitality, this is 90% of the battle. So if this math equation isn't working, we have to look at some of these overhead management teams, as well as the 4 walls, but we really have to look at everything, because that bottom line has to make sense.
Yeah, exactly. There's no kind of shortcut to that. Once you do the math, like Ann said, it's a pretty simple equation. If those numbers don't add up to what you're going to try to get to, it's not ever going to get that way.
It's never.
Doesn't matter how hard the operations team phases labor or manages food costs. If you have too much on that corporate overhead side, they're not going to be able to push the needle far enough to make up what they're, the unsales generating people are not doing.
Well, exactly. And I think, the other part of this is the whole, again, having that different standard of, we're either making money or we're not. Right. And at the end of the day, there's so many times where we see people go to try to sell their business, to try to pass it on to the next generation. And it's very hard to show anything. Right? We really show zero value. Even you bought a business and it's underperforming and now it's not worth what you paid. Right. So there's real dollars here, and we have to know this valuation and be pushing this forward, because you never know what's going to happen. Right. Like, life is short. There's, things can happen, and we cannot wait for the future to prove out this valuation. So these are urgent things that we want to start taking a look at and make sure that our ducks are in a row, and that at the end of the day, our operation is sustainable. So the final piece of that, which is, I think so many times too, as we get in this mode, we're cutting costs, we're cutting our management team, whatever we're doing, we forget that revenue plays a part too. And I think looking at ways to diversify our revenue, maybe we've had changing patterns. The last couple of years, we've had like lower catering, but maybe catering's coming back. What are some of the ways that we can, diversify our revenue so we're not so tied to one customer or one product?
Yeah, we talk a lot that sales cures a lot. And that's where, whenever we talk to, a client of ours or someone that's a potential client is figuring out ways to build top sales first. I mean, we're not trying, our number one goal is not to go get someone out of a job or lose somebody. We want to build sales so that we can afford those people.
Yeah.
And I think it's just thinking differently on how you've done things in the past. Maybe for, like Ann was saying, catering is a big part. Maybe some of that catering has come back, but maybe it's not looking for a party of 50. Maybe it's going after, 4 parties of 15.
Right.
And I think that's how, you're looking at developing maybe an off-site premise. Maybe it's trying to do some of the off-site catering, whether it's office buildings. So let's say a lot of offices don't have as many employees there anymore.
Yeah.
That's okay, but we just need to find more of them in the past.
Right.
If there's only 10 to 12 people per office, we need to just have 5 of them instead of 1 of them.
Right.
And that's not a problem, but if we're still relying on only 1 of them,
Right.
it's not going to get us to the goals that we need to be at.
Exactly. And I think that's also where, as we're looking at ourselves as, a bigger organization, we're looking to grow and scale. I mean, this can really be a role for the owner, right? You are the ambassador of your brand. You're the face to your brand. And a lot of our clients that have been able to diversify really have done it by going back to some of that face-to-face stuff. Right? A few clients that have gone back out, hey, I am making these relationships. I'm now, the preferred vendor of this organization that has a big event or whatever it is. But I think, the other part of COVID is some of those relationships were lost. People left, they moved away. But, now is really a great time to get back out there. And what's so funny is we have one guy who's really seeing the results of it, right? He kind of made himself the ambassador, a few weeks or a few months ago now. And the last few months, it's like you really see the impact in the sales. And it's all about these, little relationships, 1 event a month, somewhere here, this community person is now promoting them. And without spending all the money in marketing, you've now added so many different revenue channels than you had before.
Yeah, and we've seen that with a lot of the people we talk to that there's a lot of restaurants that are way more successful than they were 3 years ago because some of that to-go or catering sales that they picked up or they got better at. They're using better to-go containers and they've created some products that are better to go and that can travel better. They're seeing that kind of succeed, whether it's catering school events or sports team events. So I think it's a matter of maybe taking what you've learned in COVID and don't go away from that completely. If you did some things that went really well, now try to kind of build on that. We're seeing the food trucks kind of continue, right? That hasn't gone away. Right. A lot of the people we haven't worked food trucks, they've gone from 1 to 3 now. So I think it's a matter of, see what has worked and using those to kind of continue to use your brand, but build out.
Yeah, and I think so many times, people hate to think of themselves as the face of the brand, right? A lot of times this is something that's not natural to them or not something they really thought about having to do. But I think in that way, listen to your customers, because we're not saying that, it's your picture for the sake of your picture, but it's just a way to connect with your customer. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're listening to what they want. So like you said, if you have a customer base that loves to go, then we want to listen to that and provide more of that. If we have a customer base that loves, going out downtown to special events, hey, why don't we be there and be part of that event? So that's really what we're saying. It's not, all of a sudden you have to do all the marketing and and it's just you, but we're just saying that, as the owner, as the face of the brand, sometimes you can listen to the customers in a different way. Like they're going to open to you more than they may your server or your back of house team. But if we're listening and we're paying attention, we want to create these craveable things that the customers want that will help elevate our brand.
Right.
All right, so now we have steps to strengthen our profitability. So as we talked about before, profitability, we cannot stress this enough, that we really want to make sure that we're dialing into our profitability as the first step. So one of those things is definitely analyze the financials, but again, a step beyond that is ask questions of your accounting team. So many times when we get into multi-unit, franchise models, restaurant group models, there is stuff flying from location to location, right? Like we got, this location can only afford this, so I charge more to the other one because it can afford more. which from the accounting standpoint, they're not wrong, right? They're trying to do what they're doing. But inadvertently, you've now given up the management of your P&L to your accounting team. And I'm an accountant, but that's not where it should live, right? We want to make sure that we can see very clearly the profitability of each location, and then the overhead, the share, the brand stuff in a separate bucket. Because ultimately, if there's a weight on your profitability, if you're not seeing your profitability, one of two things are happening, right? One is you have an underperforming store or several stores that are just dragging down and they just don't make sense. And so the free cash from the good ones is going to offset the bad ones. The other thing that could have happened is this overhead has gotten a lot more expensive in the last 5 years. So that management team that cost you X now costs you at least 20%, 30% more. Your advertising is more. Marketing, acquisition costs are more. Like debt service is more. There's all these more things in a separate bucket that have nothing to do with your locations. So to analyze our profitability, we have to look at both collectively. And we have to start with what's the bottom line number we need this to be and work backwards. Because so many times, again, from the accounting team, they're not doing it wrong, but they're saying, oh, well, here's my management team. I have to find a place to put it. And we can't, because then you're never going to see, is that the right cost of the management team? Is that the right cost of the marketing? And what's my budget for my overhead to make sure that there's dollars left at the bottom line? So as we said here, we have a lot of good points to the profitability. We also have some PDFs you can find on our website by emailing us. But this is a really key way to look at the profitability that I think so many restaurant groups miss. All right, so our next one is weekly accountability. Now, again, we talked a little bit about this before, but really what we want to do here is dive into what we mean by weekly accountability. So as a takeaway to you, as next step really would be, are you looking at things weekly, right? Asking the questions to, I wouldn't even ask the accounting team. Again, not that we don't like them, they're fine. But I would ask your GM, what numbers are they getting every week? Right, to make sure they're getting enough.
And this is one of those things coming from like a corporate restaurant background. It's almost hard to imagine not looking at it weekly. But we understand that that's not the norm. But that's one of those things where I don't know how I would plan for the next week if I didn't know my results for the first week. So I think, like Dan said earlier, if you don't have all your information, that's okay. But whatever information you do have from 1 week, let's use that for the following week. And then let's use those first 2 weeks for week 3 and so on. I think that's where really it's...
Yeah, and again, I go back to, is this old process, old way of doing things kind of weighing down your organization as a whole, which is why, as much as I think your accountant's great, I like them, they're very nice, this is not a question they can answer, right? This is the question between, whoever the owner is, CEO, and that GM. Because if that GM is not getting some sort of feedback every week on cost of goods, labor, and sales, then their hands are tied.
Right. No, definitely. If you're going into the second half of the month and you don't know where you are versus last year or whatever way you're trending on the last 6 weeks or 2 months, however you want to look at it, how are you going to know what to predict the next two weeks? And that's where all that stuff comes in. How do you know what to spend on small wares? And how do you know what to spend on to-goes and paper supplies? Yeah. How do you know how much labor to bring in if you're not really sure what you're going to do versus however you kind of track that? And the best thing for us, I've always used it versus last year and then a trend. The easiest way to kind of predict sales.
Yeah. And then I think making sure that we are raising the red flag, if we see cost of goods just aren't getting to the number they're supposed to, really digging into, is it efficiency, controls? Because part of weekly accountability is more than just the accounting, right? It's checklists. It's making sure that we're following all the safety protocol. It's making sure that we have the internal controls, right? People bringing in all the sales. Because if we have an underperforming store, maybe it's that people aren't bringing in the sales. Like, we've had that. Yeah. So, we need to make sure that part of weekly accountability is, some sort of understanding of each store performance and really making sure that we're moving the needle forward and improving every week. All right, so then our next one, again, we talked a little bit before, but really action item here on the management team would be to look at the org chart, right? So really taking a look at all your managers, what are the roles, and is there a way to be creative? Maybe it's not, eliminating a position, but definitely rather than hiring a new manager, is there a way to restructure the management team in a way that they're able to do more, not adding work to them, but just being more efficient? And we've seen that a lot of times with, I know you've talked with some of your clients on, shared ordering responsibilities, things like that.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot, especially as we're seeing that manager wage go up, and we're seeing to get a really good general manager, it's going up. But like we said, we do think there is value in having a great general manager that can lead your restaurant. So maybe it's a general manager overseeing 2 or 3 stores, depending on how busy you are. It's all going to come back to volume. If you're doing $6 million out of your restaurant, you don't need to worry about that.
Right, you need a GM.
You need a GM. But when you're doing 600,000 or 700,000, that's when I think you look at, what's the responsibilities of that general manager? Are they just shift managers for some of the time, and can that translate to other? Like Ann said, also, we're seeing some of our clients that, hey, you need to buy a case of buttermilk, but your store is not busy enough to go through a case of buttermilk. So if you have 2 stores right near each other, could they share that?
Yeah.
There are some things of getting creative, so not to just waste produce or waste items like that, and again to share some of those management responsibilities over multiple locations. We are seeing some initial benefit right away with some of that.
Yeah, and I think so many of these discussions, again, outside of the corporate office, outside of just, we're in a conference room with the CFO and the accounting team, this is really something to do with your operations team. Like, see what their skills are, what are the skills that we don't know they even have, and how can we develop them, because that's probably what they would like as well, and fill some of these gaps on our management team.
Yes.
All right, and then our final action item is revenue. Here, more than anything, is looking at, what are the different areas that I could look at for revenue, rather than look at just, it's an underperforming store, the sales are down, they are what they are. I mean, so many times when we do these exercises, it's an aha. I mean, I've done this with a few clients where it's like, okay, well, in order for this to work, your sales have to be 300,000 more than they are.
Right.
Like, that's what it is, right? This location has to bring in 300,000 more a year, which, as scary as that sounds, opens the door to being creative. Oh, well, maybe if I, contact the local sports complex, maybe if I could be the caterer of choice for the school, like, all of a sudden we really start to think that, first of all, 300,000 over a year, not terrible, right? But also saying, okay, if status quo is not an option, right, I have to be creative in these different ways. And I think by setting these targets, we really can start to look at some of the areas where there's sales that we're not getting.
Yeah, and that's why with all the technology that we're seeing with POS systems, it probably breaks it down to day part. It probably breaks it down to go versus dine in. So you have a lot of this knowledge at your fingertips of using and seeing where, all right, is happy hour down? Well, let's try something different for happy hour then.
Yeah.
Is it late night? Is it lunch? And I think the more information you have for your business to know, you can kind of know where to attack those areas. Because like you said, while 300,000 sounds like a lot, if you could add, a few $100s a day, a couple $1,000s a week on something that's only one part of it, you could probably eat a nice chunk of that right away by just doing something a little different in one of your areas.
Exactly. And I think that where it sort of goes back to mindset, where, if our mindset is we're not accepting where we are right now, right? We're not accepting status quo. We are going to find a way to get this to work. I mean, I've heard people say, I look at my restaurant as, I have front of house, but then I have a kitchen. Right? So if I need to do other things out of my kitchen that have nothing to do with my restaurant, I'm going to do it, right? And that's that mindset of like, we're going to find a way to get to the revenue target that gets our value that we want out of this business.
Yeah. And we've seen that with just like the ghost kitchens, right? People are using ghost kitchens, and we're not recommending that that's going to fit everybody, but just the theory that somebody had a kitchen and maybe they're only open for lunch and breakfast, and now they're like, hey, someone else wants to rent my kitchen to use on DoorDash or Uber Eats at night. Again, we're not saying that's a solve, but it's another way. We're just, again, adding in the Uber Eats and DoorDash. If you're not doing that, it's a whole other sales platform that might work for you. Again, it might not work for everybody, but it's another way to look at your business and say, hey, it's working for somebody, let's try this. And if it does work, what it could add to your business and profit.
Yeah, and that's where I think, more than anything, the worst thing we can do is just stand back and wait, right? The whole idea of this podcast about, our valuation one of coming up with the value of our business today and now creating value in our business is to say, let's not wait back another year, right? Let's try some of these things to see if we truly can move the needle and add value to our business, which will add value to our life, right? Like, you will now have a more valuable asset by doing some of these things. And there's value there, and there's such a good life lesson there.
Yeah, and even if you don't sell it, you now just have more money,
Exactly.
right? Like, it's a kind of a win-win. If you don't end up selling the business because there's more value, you just have more money in your
Yes.
bottom line, in your pocket
Yes.
at the end of the day. So it's sort of kind of a no-brainer.
Yes.
You're doing all these to increase the value, but if you don't sell, you can just take the money and...
Right. But either way, you're in control.
Yes.
Right. So if we're sitting back 20 years from now and we don't have the number that we want, I mean, the reality is we're in control, right? So we are creating a better future by doing these changes today rather than waiting a year.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on this week's episode. If you'd like more information on the Franchise Accelerator program, as well as some of our PDFs that we covered today, please register on our website and we will make sure that you get them. Thanks, Scott. That was another great episode.